Hi everyone, this is Grandmaster Eugene Perlstein, and welcome you to part 3 of the Stonewall series. So in part 1 and part 2, I talked about the most widely played way for white against the Stonewall, where white typically fianchettos his light square bishop on g2. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about a different setup for white, where white usually doesn't fianchetto the bishop, and also at the very end I will give you a very thematic play from the Top Guns, how the Stonewall managed to score a point at the 2700 plus level. So what other ways white can try to fight the Stonewall? Well, this could happen from various move orders. As I mentioned earlier, black can play f5, the Dutch move order, the e6, the French move order, or the simply d5, c6, the Slav move order. And now after e6 we get this triangle. By the way, for those of you who like this move order for black, you still have the option of playing knight f6. And one thing you got to worry about is this gambit line, the Slav gambit with e4. So if you want to learn it with this move order, you really have to know this is the most sharp way to meet it. You can try to play bishop b4 here if you don't want to go into like super sharp details. But again, this is something for you to know. So anyways, we're talking about the Stonewall pawn structure, and it could be reached via various move orders, and here is one of them. White doesn't fianchetto the bishop. Instead, bishop is on a nice d3 square, and here the move f5 is a perfect Stonewall. This bishop is going to be restricted, whereas the black's bishop is really going to have power on the h2 ba diagonal. So white has several choices. White can put the knight on the g knight on e2 or f3. Let's take a look at knight f3 first. So knight f6, castles, castles. So this bishop is just as bad as this bishop. I like this position for black a lot. So clearly white wants to try to solve the problem of his dark square bishop, and black can do the same thing with the move b6. And the position could get about equal, after a simple bishop b2, bishop b7, rook c1, knight e4. So this could happen, and typically the plan again is you play knight d7, queen can come to f6 or e7, and depending on what white does, you can do the king side attack or play in the center and try to undermine it with the move c5. Now, what else could happen? You can play b6 against b3, or you can immediately try to play for knight e4 plan. So by having the knight on f3 and the bishop on d3, it's really hard for white to drive this e4 knight out. So bishop b2, simply knight d7, knight e2. This is a typical plan. You can't really exchange the knight, so you might as well try to fight for the dark squares here. Now queen f6. Notice that it's really hard to play knight e5 now. Now we've got bishop, knight, and queen. And guess what? The f5 pawn gives black a lot of space, and that space could be used, you guessed it right, for attacking the king. Rook c1, g5. One may think that this is a suicide mission, you're opening up your own king, but if you really understand that this powerful outpost, this space advantage, and these pawns really give black power, so to say, to start his attack. And again, white is kind of helpless. You can't really do any damage in the center. You can start pushing pawns on the queen side, but you can't really go that far. So rook c2, this actually happened in the Grandmaster game, and after g4, white retreated to d2, and really I like black's position after queen h6 here. Threatening a little mate in one, forcing white to create even more weaknesses. Now white is really feeling uncomfortable with his king being there stuck on g1. And here I In the Grandmaster game, black, I think, played rook f6, which allowed white off the hook with bishop takes. I really like the move knight g5. Why? Well, these are holes. You might as well occupy them with your pieces. And after knight g5, knight f4, trying to build defense at least against the knight h3 check, simply knight f6, and I think black has great chances for attack. So again, you could have tried the b6 plan earlier with bishop b7 with totally fine position, or the knight e4, knight d7, queen f6, g5, g4 plan. I like it a lot, actually, for black. So what else can white do? Well, white doesn't have to develop his knight to f3. And as a matter of fact, white himself can try to get a sort of dangerous setup against black by not even castling short. So how could that happen? And that could happen when after d4, let's again use the standard triangle pawn structure here, e6 or c6, doesn't matter. And we get into our Stonewall, f5, bishop d3. And here again, this is the other option. So not knight f3, but knight g2. For now, white can actually play queen c2, bishop d6, and now knight g2. So this setup with bishop on d3, knight on c3, and e2, queen on c2 is somewhat dangerous for black. Why? Because white actually has the option of playing f3 at any moment, so it's going to be hard to mount our powerful knight on e4. But furthermore, notice that white hasn't castled yet. That allows white to play bishop d2 and castle queenside. So that's something to keep in mind. And I think this is the most dangerous system against the Stonewall, is especially if you're a black player and you really like attacking on the king side, you can make all the right moves and white just simply castles the other way, castles long, and your attack gets nowhere. So here, I like the move castle. So typically, again, white is not showing his plans. He's playing f3, keeping the knight at bay, potentially getting ready for bishop d2. And here, I really like this move knight a6. You're immediately asking these guys, are you going to feel comfortable against knight b4? Well, probably not. Thus the move a3. And notice that white has made all these pawn moves and hasn't castled and hasn't really developed his dark square bishop. I think it's time for black to gain some space on the queen side. D takes c, bishop takes, and b5 𝐤𝐸. And this is the way to fight for queenside initiative. So now white can simply drop back and control the long diagonal, or go on d3. Either way, black gets comfortable play. For instance, bishop a2, keeping the tension against the king. Very calm, quiet move, king h8. Well, with the pawn being on b5, ready to play b4 at any moment and open up some key files, I don't think you want to castle long if you're white. So clearly, castle short is normal. b4 anyways, knight a4. By the way, taking on b4 would only help black, because you're going to be hitting the queen and the bishop. So after b4, knight a4, and now queen c7, hitting that pawn on h2. Guess what? Now this move f3 really weakens things up. Let's say you play g3, and very calm move rook b8. The bishop is not developed. This bishop is shooting nowhere. The knight doesn't do anything, and this king could get into trouble. And black's plan is to get c5 going and really blow up white's center. For instance, bishop d2, and this actually all happened in the Grandmaster game between Alberto David and Sebastian Feller, both French Grandmasters. Queen e7, and after bishop c4 hitting the knight, there is simply this tactical shot taking on a3. Well, simply takes. And now, again, there is no need for us to go fancy and simply win a pawn. c5 is very simple and yet effective strategy in blowing up the center. It turns out that white's pieces are just not ready for it. So rook e1 happened in the game, pawn takes, knight takes, and now very subtle move, queen e8, keeping the control of that knight on a4. So knight c3, clearly you want to centralize the knight, and very calm move, knight c7. So it looks as though white's pieces are at least looking normal, but in reality, white's king is much weaker than black's counterpart. And I think white underestimated and played the bad move e4, and after bishop b7, this king really has no easy way. So he took on f5, he continued with his bad plan. It looks as though white has tremendous pressure against the e6 pawn, and he just won a pawn on f5. But e5 exclam dashes all hopes of white to get any advantage, and actually white is in trouble. Knight b5, check. These bishops are really cutting the board into white's king. Bishop e3, and after queen c6, with a simple threat, queen takes, f3, white resign. So what an interesting game. It shows you how easy white can get in trouble after the knight a6 plan. So it looks as though white made all the right moves, but after white did the setup, knight a6 really poses the question, so they have to play a3, and black gets this tremendous counterplay with b5. All right, so this pretty much concludes the typical setups that white can try to play against the Stonewall, and I want to show you a game that perfectly illustrates black's plan, and furthermore, it's between none other than Kramnik and the current world champion Vishy Anand. And another point is that the Stonewall can be reached via different openings. As we're going to see here, we have nothing in common with the Stonewall at first. This is a simple Queen's Indian opening after knight f3, b6, g3, and it just shows you that simply, even if you don't play Stonewall yourself, simply understanding the pawn structures will go a long way, because it could happen in many other openings. So bishop a6, b3, this is all theory so far. Bishop b4 check, bishop d2. As a matter of fact, we are getting sort of like a Catalan-like possession from a Queen's Indian, bishop e7, bishop g2. So eventually, this bishop will come to c3, maybe knight bd2, with idea to go for e4. And now we're getting ready to play d5 with this move c6, bishop c3, d5, knight e5, trying to take advantage of the weakened c6 square. Black trades off the knights, knight d2, castles, castles, and this position has been played a lot, and white's main plan is e4. And guess what? Anand plays d5, totally stopping e4 from happening. And now we got ourselves a Stonewall. The only difference is that we got one pair of knights exchanged, and we got the bishop on a6. Yet the ideas remain the same. White will try to play on the queen side, and black will try to get an attack against the enemy king. So rook c1, Anand plays knight f6, bishop b2. So Kramnik is not in a hurry, and notice the position is still close. So both sides are just setting things up. Bishop d6. Remember I told you this is a good square for the bishop. Maybe a queen will come to e7, knight f3. So knight is potentially eyeing the e5 outpost. Queen e7, knight e5. So both sides have finished the development. White has some trumps. This knight on e5 is like, basically you can compare it to a very annoying piece like a bone sort of in black's throat. But in reality, black can play around this knight. Simply rook c8. Again, there is no follow-up with this knight, so Kramnik plays knight d3, rook d8, rook e1. This is a subtle move to try to avoid any pressure on the long diagonal. Maybe he is playing for this f3 e4 push, perhaps. Queen e8, again, very subtle move from the world champion, and e3. So both sides sort of put their pieces and pawns on the best squares. The knight controls all the key squares. Maybe c5 on the right moment for white. And black finally starts his attack, g5. Again, just because the center is closed, it justifies the move g5. If the center can get open quickly, then usually attacks on the wing are not sufficient. But here, white can't really stop it, so rook c2, g4, gaining more space. And now we really have these key squares for black. Queen c1, so Kramnik is trying to put pressure on the file. Queen e7, not in a hurry. Rook d1, knight e4. Finally, we got the outpost, and c5. So we got the king side attack. Potentially, maybe we're going to play here, and white is putting pressure on the c file. So the plans are drawn out. So takes, and simply bishop b8. It looks as though this bishop is a monster now, but in reality, you're going to see shortly, white doesn't really have anything going on that diagonal. So knight e5, knight g5, queen a1. Again, the knight is sort of on the way, but Anand simply trades it, and after the trade, king takes. So really, there is really nothing going on. So it looks nice, but queen and bishop can't really do any damage there. Whereas black has a very clear plan to try to get attack here. So you see both sides sort of play their game, and now Kramnik starts his queenside plan. Black plays h5, b4, h4. So things are really getting interesting. b5. So it looks as though white got to black first. Now there is this pawn sacrifice that we have to worry about, but the thing about the queen side is that you can simply drop back and not worry about anything. You're still sort of in the wall formation. You're not afraid of anything. So rook c1, king g6. This looks kind of interesting. Bishop e5. It looks as though white is getting the upper hand here, but in reality it's all deceptive. Even though you managed to get this bishop in a bad square, you managed to exchange dark square bishop, there is still one important trump, and that trump is this weakened king. Queen f6, offering the exchange of queens. Queen d4. And I think really with this move, queen d4, Kramnik overestimated his position, and he didn't sense the danger that he could easily get in trouble. He should have probably went for the endgame. There's really no advantage in the endgame at all. Black will still go for e5. But after queen d4, e5 exclam, queen b4, we open up the h file, and guess what? All black has to do is simply double up on the h file, or maybe even triple up, and this guy's going to get in trouble. So queen a5. Now we totally ignore the whole queen side. Rook h8, queen takes pawn, f4 exclam. And it looks like this queen is deep into the enemy territory. The material advantage means absolutely nothing here. It's going after the king that wins the game. So after trade, Kramnik takes, double up. So things are really getting dangerous for white's king. Queen b6, queen takes. It looks as though, again, after pawn takes, bishop's hit, the king's in the crossfire, but in reality, the game is lost. If you want to find the finishing touch here, this is a good time to pause the video and find the beautiful tactic. And the winning move is queen f3. You put your queen under attack without even a single check, yet you're allowing your opponent to take your bishop with check. And yet, white is totally lost. And this is a perfect game by Anand, and after king f5, Kramnik simply resigned. Believe it or not, there is no defense after mate, after bishop takes, pawn takes. You can even get a queen if you want, but it doesn't help you. Rook h1 mate. So with this fantastic attack and win, I want to conclude part 3 of the series on the Stonewall. Again, the key here is to understand the pawn structure, to understand common plans for white and for black, and in particular, how to counter them. So I thank you very much. This was Grandmaster Eugene Perelstein.